am back! Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Andy's Witchcraft by me, Sacred Moon. I hope you're all having a wonderful day and that you've had a restful few months since I had my little break. I recently started my master's program, and so I've had to prioritize school over podcasting and other hobbies. But now that I'm on break, I figured I would take the time to research and do a couple of episodes and get back into my witchy practice, which I'm really enjoying so far. I've done a lot, and it's just been a really good experience to get back into. And so today, I figured why not kind of talk about the combination of all my spiritual beliefs by talking about the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, how it relates to Christianity, and how I incorporate it in my witchcraft. So take a seat, relax, put your headphones in if that's what you do, and let's take a listen. Are you guys ready? Woo! So, the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism are just one of the many knowledges that Siddhartha Gautama, also known as the Buddha, kind of spread when he reached enlightenment. He states that to achieve anything noble in this life, we need effort and dedication. The Buddha went through years of hardship and mindful practice before he reached enlightenment, and in his time, he gave several famous teachings. This is what we call the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha. So in giving us the Dharma, which, by the way, translates roughly to truth, but it's in Sanskrit. So he gave us the tools to experience what he experienced. He experienced the ceasing of suffering, and he wanted to teach us how we too can end the cycle of suffering through the Four Noble Truths and the eightfold path. So after the Buddha attained enlightenment in Bodh Gaya, he taught the Four Noble Truths to his first 5 disciples, who then spread the word to numerous other peoples. The Four Noble Truths are the basic teachings of the Buddha, and these truths focus on the goal, practice, and philosophy of Buddhism. So, now that you know the brief overview of what the Four Noble Truths means, let's go into detail on each of them. Number 1, suffering or dukkha. This is the first Noble Truths, and it's the truth of suffering. This is that life will always have suffering no matter who you are or where you come from. And when we say the word suffering, it's not necessarily some form of extreme pain or trauma. So it doesn't necessarily have to be severe suffering, but it could refer to the fact that everything is temporary and impermanent, and we may not like change, and that discomfort with change is a form of suffering. So it shows up in our lives in both obvious and subtle ways. But the 3 obvious kinds of suffering that correspond to the first 3 sites of the Buddha are incorporated in the definition of suffering. So when the Buddha left his palace and went to the outside world for the first time ever, he saw 3 kinds of sufferings, took note of them, and figured that he wanted to go on a journey to ease that suffering. The 3 sites were old age, sickness, and death. So the first noble truth is just to get out of that denial, get out of that mentality that I don't want to suffer and I'm going to avoid it at all costs. We can't avoid suffering. So how does this relate to Christianity? There are many Bible verses that also talk about suffering and the human features of it. So the first Bible verse I'm going to talk about is 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. This is to say that if you are suffering in your physical body, that is, it's a form of suffering and it sucks, but it is not as detrimental or as permanent as getting in that suffering mentality of, in the mind. And I worded that weirdly, but that's the best way I could kind of put it. Yes, suffering of the body sucks. But if that is the only form of suffering you are experiencing, in the Bible, in biblical terms, they called that a blessing. Now, whether I agree with that personally or not necessarily. That's invalidating people's suffering, in my opinion. And as someone that's a future social worker, that's just a big no-no to me. Again, this is the interpretation from biblical times, from historical, and it's definitely changed over time. But that's just something that the Bible says, is that, if you're suffering in the body, it just shows that you are doing whatever you can to keep your mind and your spirit pure or free of sin. So that's that verse. The next verse is 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. This is to say that suffering is temporary and that it's going to end eventually. And we're going to talk about that in the third and fourth noble truths. But right now, just keep in mind that suffering is temporary, and that the moment that we feel that suffering is going to be forever and that things are going to suck forever, that is when we cause more suffering for ourselves. So even in the Bible, it acknowledges and appreciates this fact. The next verse is 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12. In fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. This is to say that those that are pure of heart and those that want to spread message of love and compassion, sometimes you're going to be taken advantage of. You're going to be persecuted. And that is a form of suffering. So no matter what, whether you are a horrible human being who does poor actions and hurts people and, causes humanity suffering, you're causing yourself suffering. And if you're a good person who spreads compassion to people, you're still going to have a form of suffering. And sometimes it's just going to be other people that persecute you. And there's no way to escape that. So all we can do is live the best lives for ourselves. So that's what that verse is saying. Next is Colossians chapter 1, verse 12. Verse 24, not 12. 24. Now I rejoice in what I am suffering for you, and I fill up in my flesh what is still lacking in regard to Christ's afflictions, for the sake of his body, which is the church. So this is, again, just putting forth the fact that people are going to suffer for a good cause or a greater cause. In this case, it's the holiness, it's the church, the body, Christ's teachings. And so suffering, sometimes when we do the right thing, we got to do it even if it causes us suffering. And that's kind of what this is talking about. Next, we have Isaiah chapter 53, verse 3. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Again, this is just talking about the fact that humanity is going to spread all kinds of suffering, and again, we're going to experience it. We can't be in denial about it. And finally, we have James chapter 1, verse 12. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. So, yeah, we're going to suffer in this life, but in the afterlife, there will be free of suffering once we reach heaven. And that's kind of what we talk about when we talk about in Buddhism ending the cycle of samsara, the cycle of rebirth, birth and rebirth, and continuous suffering. One day, when we figure out how to reach that enlightenment and we go to heaven, we're going to end that cycle of suffering and our suffering will end. So again, it's temporary, not only in the short term of this life, but it is temporary in the sense that one day we will reach enlightenment and our cycle of suffering is going to end. And that's kind of what this Bible verse is getting at in more Christian terms. So not talking about rebirth and birth, but just more so talking about that we're going to go through trials and tribulations now, but one day God promises us that we're going to reach a land where there is no more suffering. Now, let's talk about the second noble truth. This is called the cause of suffering, or samudaya. So what is the cause of suffering? The Buddha acknowledges many causes, but some of them are ignorance, craving, unhealthy attachments, misunderstandings about our own nature and the nature of reality. So We focus too much on how things should be and not enough on how things actually are. We suffer because of our mistaken belief that we are separate, independent, and permanent beings. And this struggle maintains the delusion of ego and leads to our cyclical existence, otherwise known as samsara. The Buddha taught that the root of all suffering is desire, also known as tanha, and this comes in three forms, which he calls the three roots of evil, or the three fires, or the three poisons. And those are greed and desire, ignorance or delusion, and hatred and destructive urges. The Buddha taught more about suffering in his fire sermon, where he delivered this sermon to thousands of Buddhist monks, also known as bhikkhus. And he said that bhikkhus, all is burning. And what is the all that is burning? The eye is burning, forms are burning, eye consciousness is burning, eye contact is burning. Also, whatever is felt as pleasant or painful, or neither painful nor pleasant, that arises with eye contact for its indispensable condition, that too is burning. Burning with what? Burning with the fire of lust, the fire of hate, with the fire of delusion. I say it is burning with birth, aging, and death, with sorrows, with lamentations, with pains, with griefs, with despairs. So there he is talking about the causes of suffering in this lifetime. And so there are many Bible verses that talk about these things. Tons of Bible verses where God is saying, don't be greedy, don't be ignorant, be open-minded to gaining new knowledge. Don't hate, don't do things that harm yourself and others. These are all of God's teachings from the 10 Commandments, where he says, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery. Those are forms of suffering that we pass on. But other than that, there are many other Bible verses that talk about the causes of suffering. Isaiah chapter 53 verse 3 says, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. So, like I said, this talks about suffering, but also talks about the causes of suffering, which is rejection from humanity, humanity despising, humanity spreading hatred, and how we can cause suffering to not only themselves, but the people they pass that pain on to. Next, we have 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 3. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. This talks about a form of greed where we're greedy for acknowledgement, and we're greedy for attention and praise and being that egocentric person. Yes, he gave everything he wanted to the poor and gave his body over to to the suffering, and he did all these good deeds, but his intention was not pure. His intention was to boast, not out of love, not out of compassion, but out of ego. And that is a form of suffering that we cause ourselves. He gains nothing, and he lost everything. He gave everything away, but what did he gain? So that is a form of cause of suffering. And next we have 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 14. But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. Again, talking about suffering in the sense that we're doing what is right. Our intentions are pure, but sometimes we just get suffering because others do not have the same intentions. Some still have malicious intent. Some are still harmful. So, all that to say is, humanity is the cause of suffering, but, there are still individual good people, and we have to acknowledge these things, to acknowledge that suffering is temporary. The world is not the best place right now. There's war, there's political conflict, there's, economic disparities, there's homelessness, there's mental health issues and not enough supports, not enough resources. But we have to acknowledge that all of this is temporary. This suffering is temporary, and we can still do our part to spread compassion. Because no matter what we suffer, we might as well do good deeds despite our suffering. And that's kind of what the Buddhist teaching is going about. And that's what God's teaching is going about. Turn the other cheek. If someone slaps your one cheek, you got to turn the other cheek. Give them the other cheek. Still be compassionate. Don't let them ruin your soul, your spirit. Be a compassionate person. So there are definitely lots of verses on the causes of suffering. And some of them do cause a lot of fear mongering. So unfortunately, the Bible written by men who had an agenda, and they say things like, if you don't believe in God, you're going to suffer. That's your cause of suffering, is not believing in God, not following Christ, yada, yada, yada. And this is all fear-mongering. So a lot of these verses I'm not necessarily going to quote, but it's just kind of for your reference, where there's chapters and verses that talk about the causes of suffering. Feel free to interpret any of the following how you feel is right. If you say, oh, this verse doesn't resonate with me, I'm just not going to focus on it, that's okay too. You don't have to agree with the entire Bible to believe in God and love him and worship him. You can have disagreements. God gave you free will to have those disagreements. And again, the Bible was written by man, and men are fallible. So, the following verses do talk about suffering. They are Genesis, the entire chapter 3, Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, Deuteronomy chapter 28, the entire book of Job, Acts chapter 7, verses 54 to 60, Hebrews chapter 11, Luke chapter 13, verses 1 to 4, Romans chapter 8, verses 28 to 30, James chapter 1, verses 2 to 4, Philippians chapter 3, verse 10, and 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. So, those are all the verses on the causes of suffering. Again, there are plenty more, but those are the ones that I kind of noted for this episode's purpose. The third noble truth is the end of suffering, and this is called Nirodha. This is the good news. This is the good news, guys. And it's that suffering is temporary. So this is the noble truth that states explicitly that suffering does not last forever. And if we treat it as temporary, it will come to an end. So our enlightened nature is always present within us to help guide us out of suffering. You can call this the Holy Spirit or the universe or your third eye or your enlightened nature, whatever you prefer. But the point is that suffering can end because you have the ability within you. So we can reach a state of freedom, peace, and liberation from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Nirvana is roughly translated in English to extinguishing. So to attain nirvana, which means you've reached enlightenment, it means you've extinguished the three fires of greed, delusion, and hatred that we talked about in the previous Noble Truth. And so nirvana is a state of mind that humans can reach. It is a state of profound spiritual joy without negative emotions and fears. We are finally filled with compassion for all living things when we reach nirvana. So the way I cope with suffering and the way I acknowledge on a daily basis that suffering can end is by doing two things on a daily basis. The first is I think about the Serenity Prayer, and sometimes I will say it several times throughout the day. God, or you can change it to your higher power, or you could change it to whatever deity you work with. Like, that's the great thing. You could just replace the word God with whatever. So sometimes if I'm working with a particular deity like Lucifer or Kali, I'll replace their names there. But again, yeah. So the Serenity Prayer, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So that's something that really helps remind me that suffering can end. I can end my suffering as long as I just accept and try to work towards addressing my actions. Along with that, I try my best, at least, to recite the Buddha's remembrances and antidotes of the remembrances on a daily basis. So I will read to you the antidotes of the remembrances. It really is a beautiful, beautiful piece of writing. It wasn't actually written by the Buddha. It was written, I forget the author's name. What was their name? It was, okay, I remember now. Thich Nhat Hanh. I hope I pronounced that right. It's always hard for me. But anyways, he wrote in one of his books, The Antidotes of the Remembrances, and they were based on the sites of the Buddha and the Buddhist teachings of suffering. So I'll read it to you now, and hopefully something resonates. So, although I am of the nature to grow old, and there is no way to escape growing old, there are gifts in growing old. Many never get the opportunity to grow old. I can be grateful that I have lived long enough to be old. Although I am of the nature to have ill health, and there is no way to escape ill health, I don't need to fear ill health. Pain will be managed, and the loss of ability I might experience does not mean I have to be miserable. Misery is optional. The loss of one ability opens the door to others I would never have explored. Although I am of the nature to die, and there is no way to escape death, I don't need to fear death. Death is natural and normal and makes way for new life. I don't need to be greedy about life. I can make space for others when my time comes. Although all that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change, and there is no way to escape being separated from them, I need not fear this. Change is healthy, and I want those dear to me to be healthy, even if it means I have to work through my sadness at losing them. Sadness is temporary if I treat it respectfully. My actions are my only true belongings. I cannot escape the consequences of my actions. My actions are the ground upon which I stand. There is nothing to fear here. It is freeing to realize that all I need concern myself with are my own actions. If I am reading this, then I am already doing the work to be responsible with my actions. I am already on the path. So those are the antidotes to the remembrances. And so now Bible verses, so connecting it with Christianity. I bet that you guys have already made some of these connections in your mind if you're familiar with the Bible. But the first Bible verse I have here is Isaiah chapter 43, verse 2. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. So that's just talking about, sorry, I hit my hand there. You probably heard that bump. Anyways, that is just talking about, that suffering will end if we just trust in God and trust in our higher power or our spirit team, whatever you prefer to refer to it as. If you just trust in the universe's energy and that balance will be restored, it will be restored. You just need to give it time. Next is Romans chapter 5, verses 3-5. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame. So again, this is talking about transforming our sufferings, using them as an opportunity to learn and to grow as human beings. Next, we have 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Again, it's temporary, it's going to end, and there's a purpose beyond this world. I'm not going to say there's a purpose for suffering, because I hate it when they say everything happens for a reason. That has good intentions, but it's not always helpful to say. So I'm not going to say it here because sometimes there is no reason. Sometimes people do bad things. Sometimes people abuse their free will. And it's not, anybody's fault. And there is no reason. And things happen randomly in this universe where atoms are just moving at random directions. But, in the end, suffering is going to end. It is temporary. Next is John chapter 16, verse 33. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Again, this is all about ending suffering by trusting in the universe, trusting in your higher power, trusting in God, whatever you prefer, your spirit team, anything. Just, have faith. Next, we have Romans chapter 8, verse 18. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. So, that's, again, suffering. There's just a little bit of suffering for, hopefully an eternity of enlightenment, of peace, of serenity, of, just free of suffering. This life is going to come to an end and we're going to go to the next life, and whatever happens, we'll hope that we end up in a place where there is no suffering or less suffering than before. And finally, we have 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 10. And after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. So when you have suffered, trust that God is going to give you the tools to escape that suffering. Again, that enlightened self, the Holy Spirit, your third eye, whatever, it's already in you. You just have to activate it. You have to acknowledge it, and you have to use it. The final noble truth is called the path, or Magga. The fourth and final truth tells us that by spiritual practice, living ethically, and developing wisdom, we can go on to a path towards enlightenment and freedom from suffering. By following the eightfold path, we too can wake up. The eightfold path is also called the middle way because it avoids both indulgence and severe asceticism. So I'm not going to go over the details of the eighth path because I do already have an eightfold path episode, which I will link below so you can learn more. But just know that he, the Buddha, taught about the eightfold path as a way to give a more concrete way to escape samsara, the cycle of rebirth, and suffering. It's not 100% concrete because, obviously we have to play it by choice, Sometimes we have to play it by ear. For example, the right livelihood states that you should have a job that isn't causing harm. But these days, every job causes harm to an extent. And it causes, it causes suffering to other people to an extent. Again, suffering is inevitable. So play it by ear, and it's all about reducing it as much as possible, not eliminating it completely, but just reducing it so that others can have free and a chance to reach enlightenment and just have a freer life. And so I'm only going to list a few Bible verses that I mentioned in my Eightfold Path episode. You can, again, see the full list there if you choose to listen to the episode. But the few that I will mention, and I'm not going to read them in complete sentence. You can kind of just look it up just to save my breath. But they are Leviticus chapter 19, verse 15. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 30. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 13. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29. Colossians, I don't even know how to pronounce that. I think it's Colossians chapter 3, verse 23 to 24. And Psalm chapter 119, verses 15 to 16. That last one, Psalm chapter 119, verses 15 to 16, I love it. Actually, I'm going to read this one. It says, I will meditate on your precepts and regard your ways. I shall delight in your statutes. I shall not forget your word. And I love this because the Buddha had his own set of precepts. I may do an episode on that. We'll see how I feel. But the Buddha had his own set of precepts. his own sets of, not commandments. He didn't order people to do these things. But again, he gave recommendations on living mindfully through these precepts. And so this is such like a neutral verse, your precepts. It doesn't mention God. It doesn't mention Lord. It's just your. And so you can apply it. I can apply it to Yahweh and Asherah's commands. I can apply it to the Buddha's suggestions. I can apply it to any of my members of my spirit team. It's just, it's so good. And it's just a way to remember to live mindfully, and that your spirit team knows what's best for you more than you do. And yet we don't always listen to them. I don't always listen to them. Whoopsies. My lesson will be learned. I am human and I will make mistakes. But I want to kind of conclude this section of the Four Noble Truths by saying that the Buddha didn't really ask people to practice these methods just because he said so. He didn't order them. He didn't command them. The Buddha doesn't claim to be a god or even a saint. He just felt that blind faith wasn't worth much. He felt that people who just rely on word of mouth is fallible. Well, why should we trust people, especially these days when, people lie, people steal, people manipulate? We can't just rely on blind faith anymore. It sucks. I wish we could, but we can't. We can't just blindly trust people. And the Buddha knew this. And so knowing that the faith of our own experience is unshakable, he asked people to try these methods. Try them for yourselves. If it works for you, great. And if it doesn't, we'll see. We can take it from there. We can't unknow something once we know it for ourselves. And so that's what I love, that the humanness of Buddha. He acknowledges this, blind faith. Oh, society isn't the best to spread messages. And again, the Buddha was a complete stranger to a lot of his followers at first. And so he was like, listen, I know you probably think I'm crazy, but hear me out. Try these, see how it goes, and get back to me. It's kind of like a therapy session. That's kind of what my therapist does. Try this suggestion, and then next session we'll talk about it. The Buddha kind of did it. So the Buddha was like a secular therapist, which was pretty cool. Interesting. So I will end this episode by talking about witchy things to help with acceptance and freedom from suffering. So how can we accept suffering is going to be inevitable, and how can we free ourselves? How can we do these in witchy ways? Well, basically there are certain spells we can do. Sometimes an acceptance spell goes a long way. Do manifestation spells to help manifest more acceptance in your life. Do these certain spells or mantras, practices. Light a candle and say, may this flame help me accept the inevitability of the situation, whatever your situation is that you have no control over. The next thing is cleansing spells, and I love using a singing bowl to kind of incorporate that Buddhist practice there and mindfulness practice. Sound cleansing goes a long way. Again, it's just to cleanse yourself from the past sufferings, just letting go of the past, cleansing yourself and starting new. Banishing spells have the same concept, and you can incorporate the fire sermon, read it as you're doing your banishing spell, to banish negativity, to banish lust, to banish toxicity, to banish unhealthy desires in my life. Help me accept things that benefit me, bringing in the positive and banishing out that negativity. That's a witchy way to do this. Overall, I always ensure that my spells follow the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths. I talk about this again in my Eightfold Path episode in a lot more detail. But, if I feel that it doesn't resonate, it doesn't, align with these teachings, I don't go through with the spell. As a Christo pagan Buddhist, I incorporate all my beliefs, and they are all equally important to me. It's not a religion to me. I don't claim that Christo-pagan Buddhism is a religion, but it's a way of living. It's a way of life. It's a spirituality to me. And I incorporate this way of life into not only my divination practices, but my everyday living. And so that's just something to take away from this, a lot of people ask me, how don't they contradict one another? It doesn't. It really doesn't. And I have found a lot of success. I have found a lot of peace. I have found a lot of acceptance and, letting, whoever wants to come in my life will come, and whoever wants to leave sayonara. You know, whoever wants to cause me suffering, do it. I know my higher power has my back. You know, I know as long as I'm doing the right thing, so mote it be. But that is the end of this episode. Thank you guys so much for listening. I really appreciate it. But yeah, I'm really glad to be back, and I am thrilled and so excited. And again, you can expect one more episode to come out this month sometime before the new year. And yeah, I don't know what the episode's going to be on yet, but we'll figure that out soon. If you like this episode and you want to learn more about my practice and just keep up to date with me, especially during my breaks from this podcast, as you know, like when school starts up again, the podcast will be on a break. But if you want to keep up with me, you could follow me on social media, and at Andy's Witchcraft on Instagram, at sacredmoondivination on TikTok and Tumblr. You can also join my Discord server, Crystal Caverns. We do monthly events when we can, and we chill and hang out and share resources and just connect with other fellow witches. So that will be in the link below as well. You can also leave a video suggestion. In the link below, there is a video, or episode ideas or something like that. It's titled like that. But it is a Google form. You click on it, fill it out, and I will do an episode on it as soon as I can. And finally, I do have a divination reading business. I do have time still to take clients like throughout the semester, so it would mean the world to me if you booked a reading with me, help support me, help pay my tuition a bit. But that will be also in the link below. That is it for this episode. Thank you guys so much again for listening. I miss you all, and I'm so glad we can connect again through this podcast. Blessed be everyone. Have a wonderful day, week, month, and yeah.